if you can't get rich in America, you really can't get rich anywhere. This is the easiest country in the world to get rich. There's nothing magical about being rich. There's nothing the rich know that's beyond anybody else. Many times they're not smarter than many people. They just do things a little bit differently. Like lesson number 1, for example, was the rich don't work for money. The rich learn how to have money work hard for them. Another important lesson that my rich dad taught me was lesson number 2, was the importance of financial literacy. My rich dad was a man who believed in reading financial statements. My poor dad was a man who believed in reading books. And my rich dad always said, if you want to be rich, you have to read numbers. Fundamental to financial literacy.
Yeah, it's never enough though. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. Shit, I need more. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. Shit, I need more.
The problem is we don't teach that in school. So where people get into financial trouble once they leave school is because they don't know the difference between assets and liabilities. For example, if you can read a financial statement, you'll see that your house is really a liability. Now, most people think their house is an asset, and that's what upsets them. I'm not trying to upset people. I'm not saying don't buy a house or not to buy a big house or not to pay off your mortgage. I'm just saying don't call a liability an asset. So very simply, an asset is something that puts money in your pocket regardless if you work or not. And a liability is something that takes money from your pocket whether you work or not. Putting it even more simply, that if you stop working, assets feed you and liabilities eat you. I mean, that is that simple. The ideas between my rich dad and my poor dad, and they're just ideas, cause the biggest differences over their lifetime. The main message in this tape is about choosing to be rich really starts with choosing your idea.
It's never enough though. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. Shit, I need more. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. Shit, I need more.
Let me go back really quickly to assets and liabilities. Let's say I buy a house, I rent it out. The rent is $1,000 a month, and my expenses are $800. That means I put $200 a month in my pocket. At that moment, that house is an asset. Now, let's say, due to bad luck, the renter trashes it or does whatever renters do sometimes, and they don't pay the rent. So I have to pay the $800 in expenses, but I have no income from it. At that moment, that very same house becomes a liability. So I'm not saying don't buy a house. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying don't call liabilities assets. My poor dad became poor because he didn't know the difference. He couldn't read a financial statement. So he'd buy a house, he'd get a pay raise, he'd get in tax trouble because he was, go to his accountant and say, how can I reduce my taxes? And the accountant would say, buy a bigger house. So he'd buy a bigger house because he thought it was an asset. So now he's paying more taxes and he's paying a higher mortgage. And then he'd work harder and he'd go back to his accountant and say, what can I do? He says, buy a bigger house. And so instead of buying assets, my poor dad kept buying liabilities, and that's why he was poor. He simply did not know the difference between an asset and a liability.
It's never enough though. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. Shit, I need more. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. Shit, I need more. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. Shit, I need more. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. It's never enough though. Shit, I need more.
One last thing. A house can be an investment. It may not necessarily be an asset. In other words, many times we put money into investments and we lose the money. So an investment does not need to be an asset. The point I'm making here, which is people say, what's the first step in becoming rich? I said you have to have the vocabulary of a rich person. When I researched it, I found out that the English language has approximately 2 million words in it. And each and every one of us has command of approximately 5,000 words. Change your vocabulary.